screen here. I would like to introduce Pastor Amy Roon, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Amy has been with us here as one of our ministers for over 10 years, almost 11 years. She's starting her 12th year. And along with her clergy background, Amy is a trained and exceptionally talented musician. I'm going to out you here, Amy. You told me once that the one job that you might consider leaving the ministry for was if you got an invitation from Sweet Honey in the Rock to sing with them. And believe me, her powerful voice would be a compliment to that amazing group, which also sang in our sanctuary. So tonight, I guess I want to ask you, Amy, how's your Beyoncé repertoire?
Actually, my Beyoncé repertoire, that's a different style in terms of like the ability to pull that off as a classically trained musician with folk music. I stand in awe. That is a whole, I cannot do what she does, but I'm in awe of it.
Yes, with that, please introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Betty. Our speaker for this evening, Reverend, soon-to-be doctor, Yolanda Norton, comes to us. Her current title is quite possibly one of the longest titles I've ever encountered. She is the Crump Visiting Professor and Black Religious Scholars Group Scholar in Residence for 2020 to 2021 academic year at Seminary of the Southwest. Yolanda is also affiliated in some way, either a graduate of or having taught at Vanderbilt, San Francisco Theological Seminary, obviously Seminary of the Southwest, Wesley Theological Seminary, and she is an ordained minister with the Disciples of Christ. As Betty had mentioned, she is the curator and I don't know what all the titles, main preacher of the Beyoncé Mass, which was developed by students that were taking a class of hers of Beyoncé and the Hebrew Bible at San Francisco Theological Seminary, which as many of you may know, my own repertoire that I was at Pacific School of Religion. So I wish this class had been offered when I was in school, because I would have driven over the bridge to San Francisco to SFTS for that one, absolutely. So I am just so excited to be in conversation with you, Yolanda, and to get to hear what your thoughts and anytime I get to hear someone who is strongly rooted in a female-centric Black womanist perspective on scripture and spirituality, it makes me feel at home, and it makes me feel like creating space for us is a great gift, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be with all of you this evening. I'm grateful for the invitation to begin to have this conversation with this community. So I'm going to move in a couple of different parts. I do want to begin by telling you a little bit of the story behind how the Beyoncé Mass came into being. It's kind of a long arc that peaked in San Francisco. And then I want to talk to you about text, because that's what I do for a living. It's the space that I traffic in. And then follow in the direction of the prompt that I was given to talk about joy and sorrow and hope and grief in this particular season. I think those things will flow together hopefully quite nicely. So the story of the Mass is actually not, in my mind, very unique. I myself was not raised in the church, but as a young Black woman growing up in the South would have identified as Baptist, because anyone who is from the South understands that you have a kind of moral obligation to introduce yourself and affiliate yourself first by family, and then by denomination, and then possibly by profession and individual congregation. So while I was in no way raised in the church, and probably beginning at the age of 15, would have labeled myself anywhere between agnostic and atheist, if I were being honest, socially I felt compelled to label myself within a denominational context of a Baptist. Part of the reason that the church did not work for me as a young person is that I could not reconcile myself with two things. I did not have a good way to make sense of issues of theodicy. That is to try to wrestle with how does God's justice live in the world? And to answer that question that comes up for us in the book of Job, why do bad things happen to good people? And because I couldn't make sense of that, I didn't understand how it was we lived in such a broken space. And there was, in fact, a God who had dominion over that issue. The second reason that I really didn't affiliate myself with the church was not completely unrelated to the first. As a young Black girl who had a sense of my own worth, who grew up in a long tradition of strong Black women, I didn't understand the notion that in order to be rooted in the church, I would be a second-class human. I didn't understand that as a political struggle outside of the church, right? So it's the world in which we live, and I definitely was not willing to reconcile with it as a sacred articulation. That's to say, if the message of the church, and therefore, as it's framed in our context often, the message of God was that I was less than another human being because of my race, because of my gender, I had little to no time for that institutional endeavor. Went to college, kind of had an ecstatic encounter with the divine, the conversion moment, as it were, and then decided that it was because, I was raised to be obstinate and ornery and challenging of systems, that part of my space within a Christian context was to push back at any notions of my inferiority. And so that my calling into ministry was really about naming the sacred identity of Black women. And so I spent the better part of the past 15 years trying to make sense of living into that reality. As I was trying to live into that reality, working with other Black women and Black girls, it became a chorus. There was a persistent conversation about what it meant to be a Black woman and understand your self-worth. And people existed in a long spectrum of trying to make sense of, do I own a second-class identity and think about that as God's economy and God's ecology? Do I push back at that? And if I push back at that, is there anything sacred about this? And so in starting to do the work of making sense of how Black women encounter Christianity, the historical piece of that is understanding that for the Black church, for Black people, for marginalized people more broadly, there has never been a clear divide between the sacred and the secular. That our identities have always mandated that we gather up a multiplicity of understandings and ideas and bring them together for the sake of our survival. And so as I started to do that work, I thought, what are the things that are most life-giving for me? How do I find spaces of joy? And part of that for me is through music. I confess I can't sing a note to save my life. If I started singing now, it would make you would experience a level of pain that just feels ungodly. So I'm not someone who sings this music, but I am someone who understands the joy that comes out of it. And so wanting to be someone who was authentic in my identity and name the things and spaces that God had called me into, I decided that I wanted to do something using the music of Beyoncé. As a Hebrew Bible scholar, I teach womanist biblical interpretation. And I'm going to define this term womanist for you in a moment. I teach womanist biblical interpretation. In the regular iteration of that class, we use novels. because it is the case that both Katie Cannon and Stacey Floyd Thomas have said in intellectual spaces that when white people encounter their own fragility and issues of white supremacy, it's hard for them to do it in the form of documentaries or news. Things that are in real life feel like an affront on their identity. So the way that you help people enter into an uncomfortable space, they would say, is through novels. And so I used that practice in early iterations of my womanist biblical interpretation class, the kind of standard version. We read books like The Color Purple, The Women of Brewster Place, Sister Soldiers, The Coldest Winter Ever, and we use those novels to talk about the complex systems of intersectionality, how it is race, class, and gender weave together, and how it is racism, patriarchy, misogyny, heteroaggression, all of these things intertwine in a web that leads to a small percentage of the population naming some sort of superiority to the detriment of most people. And so when I was thinking about what are the other modes in which we have those conversations, I returned to this thought about the music of Beyoncé as a storytelling agent. And I constructed a class, Beyoncé in the Hebrew Bible. The first assignment for the students was, I want you to develop a worship service. We'll develop a worship service, and we're going to talk about how to tell Black women's stories in that worship service. But don't use hymns. Use the music of Beyoncé so that it feels relatable to people. We don't want language that stands on tradition. We don't want to live into pomp and circumstance. We want to have a very accessible moment of articulating our Christian identity in ways that gather up the whole of humanity and say you are welcome in this space. And so the short of that is that the Mass went viral without any really effort or idea from any of us who were involved that was a possibility. And so we've been on this ride ever since. We, like everyone else, have had to try to make sense of how to do the Beyoncé Mass in a world where we can't move, where we can't bring our team physically together and go to places and be physically present with people in the ways that are normal for us. And so we're living into that challenge in this world of COVID-19. And for us, while we might have normally taken a break because it would have been the easy thing to do, we felt compelled onward. And what we recognized was that Black people were dying at disproportionate rates at the hands of COVID-19, and that while we're dealing with this global pandemic of COVID-19, the global pandemic of racism continues to persist. And so we don't have the luxury of saying nothing. And so that's the journey that we have been on. So part of what we do in the Beyoncé Mass is to try to tell complex stories, which fits very much in line with the scholarship that I do as a biblical hermeneut and a womanist biblical hermeneut. So let me unpack that term alongside some other language for you in the next few moments. So I have to always name myself as being rooted in womanist biblical interpretation. Some of you might know this term, womanist. It was born out in a kind of scholarly context of the work of Alice Walker. Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, who very early on in her adult life and adult career identified as a Black feminist. And at a certain point in her life, she named that Black feminism, the term, and living in Black feminist space no longer worked for her. That the need to articulate her Blackness as an adjective of feminist inherently meant that the movement had not made space for her embodied epistemological realities. It meant that there was no one who was talking about the real lived experiences of Black women in the feminist movement. The most natural examples that I often give to my students is to name that if the priorities of the feminist movement were the right to vote and the right to work, the right to vote, when it was extended to women, was only extended to white women and necessarily left black women behind. The second piece, the right to work. Black women were already working, and most often were working as domestics in white women's home. And nothing about that movement for the right to work took into account the fact that as white women moved out of the home and into public professional spaces, the people who would be bearing the burden and picking up the slack would be black women who would be driven farther out of their homes, who would spend less time with their families, and would not obtain any more financial security in doing that work. And so naming that this space was not hospitable to black female bodies, Alice Walker conjured the language of her ancestors, of our ancestors, and leaned into the term womanist. She offers In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, a 4-part definition that I will not rehearse for you fully, but will rehearse for you in part. She names that to be a womanist is to be womanish, coming from the black folk expression of our mothers to female children. You're acting womanish, like a woman, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior. It is about the process of being forced ripened, the idea that black girls do not get to live in the skin of their childhood and often have to age prematurely in order to survive in this world. A womanist is also one who loves other women, both sexually and or non-sexually, and appreciates and potentially prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as a natural counterbalance to laughter. And I want to say that phrase again because it will become important when we get to the text. Values tears as a natural counterbalance to laughter. Womanist also loves music, loves dance, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves herself regardless, becomes a very important grounding principle for the range of work that we do in the Beyoncé Mass. And she says, as the 4th part of the definition, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And so we take up this concept of womanism. We take up the work of the Beyoncé Mass. And for just a few minutes, I want us to take up the character of Rispa as informative. And so in order to take up the character of Rispa as informative, I want to talk to you about the possibilities of how prophets show up in the biblical text. Scholars like Donald Peterson argue that there are 4 kinds of prophets presented in the Hebrew Bible. There's a Jose, the Hebrew word Jose, which is a person who is often a kind of advisor or counselor to the king. And so when you see texts like Amos 7, where you have visions that are not a response to a direct request, but an ability to see something as it is and name it into a situation, that's a Jose. And that word comes from the Hebrew word chazah, which means to see or to perceive. And so that kind of prophet is the perceiver in the group, someone who is socially, emotionally astute and able to read the room or read the society, as it were. The next kind of prophet is a ro'eh. Also, ra'ah comes from, is the Hebrew word that means to see. And so this is one who is a seer. This is a person who is a revealer of secrets, someone who envisions something. They often have some kind of consultative activity. That kind of prophet requires a social interaction in ways that are not always evident in other forms of prophetic activity. This kind of prophet is an intermediary who has an audience that takes initiative in seeking information from God, from the deity, and the prophet is often the key to their access of that information. We have our most common term for a prophet, a navi. Navi comes from is a Hebrew word that literally means to bubble up. This is someone who speaks things into the world through direct speech and it bubbles something up. It shifts the atmosphere in some very real ways. And the fourth kind of prophet that we see commonly articulated in the Hebrew Bible is what we call an Isha Elohim, literally man of God. And so this is what a term that we see used for Elijah. And these are supposed to be holy men who possess the power of the sacred. And I'm very intentionally naming the gendered language that exists around the prophet. But for me as a womanist scholar, I want to say that while the context of the Bible necessarily tries to limit the prophetic activity of women, we can have a very long, robust, multi-layered conversation about where women act as prophets in the biblical text. But I want to name this character of Rispa that we don't often talk about as a prophet. Who is this woman? Rispa is someone who shows up in 1 Samuel 3. And when she shows up in the text, her mention in the text is brief. It's almost seemingly inconsequential. She, according to how you read the Hebrew, maybe was a wife of Saul, maybe was a concubine of Saul. But when Saul dies, she becomes socially vulnerable, and she's accused by the elders in the city of having an affair with one of Saul's officials. And she disappears from the text. Part of what I would argue for you is that when she disappears from the text, that what happens is that the social conventions of the society that she is in become inconsequential to her because she is necessarily burned by those social conventions. So when she shows back up in the text in 2 Samuel 21, what we know is that she has at some point, probably before when she would have appeared in 1 Samuel, she has given birth to the son of Saul. What we also know is that Israel is in a very vulnerable situation. They are in the middle of a drought, and natural phenomena in the Hebrew Bible were necessarily about them understanding themselves as having lost favor with God. So plagues, famine, were all perceived as the result of the people having erred against God. In this moment, David, the king of Israel, he's named that God has said to him that the reason for the famine is that there is a blood guilt, meaning blood was spilled, and the blood guilt has to be repaid by the spilling of Israelite blood, and it is only when that happens that the famine will end. And so that leads David to turn over the sons and grandsons of Saul to the Gibeonites to repay the blood guilt and to ostensibly set right the Israelite cosmology. And so part of what is problematic about this is that the reader and the audience of Israel is necessarily supposed to understand that what David says God said is supreme. And when David allows for the killing, the Gibeonite murder of these young men, we are supposed to understand that as God's justice. What I appreciate about the character of Rispa, this character that we do not pay attention to, and I, if we had more time, I would talk about in more detail. What I appreciate about this character of Rispa is that she shows up and she will not let, not just her own son, but any of the bodies of any of the sons be taken down from where they were crucified, because she wants their bodies to bear witness to the overreach of David. That's to suggest that she sees it as a necessary reality that people see the ways in which the state has failed. The state as represented by David, the state has failed. Not just her, but an entire segment of society. And so her job is through her tears, through her anguish, through her grief, to bear witness to the problem, but also she stands there to protect these bodies from the birds that would have preyed on them. And so it is not until David is able to reconcile himself towards Rispa that there is any peace or justice in the text. I bring this text to light because it's work and research that I'm doing. I'm about to publish a longer piece on this, and I was brought to the work because I was invited to have a conversation about the ways in which the Christian church has participated in the proliferation of gun violence in the United States. And what I said to the rest of the audience, or the other scholars that I'm working on this book, was, you're concerned about school shootings, and as am I, but I'm concerned about guns in the hands of those people who've been given authority by the government and what that means for the vulnerability of Black bodies. So when I was, and so I brought this text to bear in this moment because when I think about the depths of my grief in 2020, I absolutely grieve this moment that we are in a pandemic, and the depths of my grief sit in the bodies of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I think we as a country have begun, maybe infinitesimally, to have conversations about the assassination of Black male bodies and the role of the state and the role of the communities that we have created in facilitating this death. But I do not think that we have begun to scratch the surface in the ways that Black female bodies have been mutilated, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. It says something about this country, this world in which we live, that when George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery died, we moved to protest in mass, as we should have. But this world did not have nearly the same scale of protest and attention to the death of Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, and a host of other Black women who most people can't name because it doesn't, in their minds, necessitate the hashtag or the attention. And so when we place the killing of these Black women in this way alongside of the other Black female deaths that we don't talk about, right? Because we are living in a world where Black female maternal mortality is high, where we're just starting to talk about the fact that when Black women go to the doctors, most doctors are unwilling to acknowledge the physical pain that Black women feel. And so how do you live in a world where you are not given space for physical, spiritual, and emotional pain, where there's no way that your grief is marked, that there's no way that people are willing to talk about your vulnerability in the world, and where we celebrate Black women who don't name their anguish, who don't name their pain. We celebrate the strong Black woman trope as if to say, if you don't name where you are, if you can name yourself as an overachiever, if you can talk about the ways that you absorb pain and keep moving, then you necessarily are the kind of Black woman that we want to see and be around. That reality, that intersection of Black female pain in this moment is the depth of my grief. And so as a kind of transitional moment, I would like to play for you a video. We're going to play another one in a few moments, but I want to play for you a video from the Beyoncé Mass that we did at Merrimack College about 2 weeks ago. And I'll say something about this on the other side of this, but part of what we do in the Mass is we give Black women voice. So we let them speak. So what you will see in the midst of the song, Beyoncé's song called Broken Hearted Girl, what you see in the midst of the song is Black women speaking about their experience in the world that I've just laid out in front of you. So I am mindful that the time has flown, time is short, and I want to invite Pastor Amy into the conversation in a moment. I do want to simply say this, return this to Rispa and Black women and their grief. Rispa in her tears was a prophet. Rispa in her anguish was a prophet. Rispa in her anger was a prophet. Her brief, perfunctory speech, her tears were the language that bubbled something up in the society and shifted the ecology and forced people to behave, if not think, differently. She didn't occupy the normal office that was given to a prophet, but she lived into the space. I think what we are seeing, what you heard in the women who spoke in this video, what you are seeing in the voice and the conversation of Black women is that we are using our speech differently to speak prophetically. If the only capacity that the world, that this society, that your communities have is to take those tears and make them spectacle, to put them on display so that people, that particular embodied people can feel woke without doing work, then it compromises the integrity of a people's ability to understand the work of the prophet. It does not compromise the prophet. It compromises the community. And so my challenge, even in my own grief, even as I sit alongside of other Black women who are grieving, is that you hear that grief and the authenticity of the grief and the persistence of the grief and the history that it exists in. And you do not make it a spectacle, but you sit with it in ways that are transformative for you, that make you self-reflective and evaluative. And you understand the strength and power that comes in a Black woman, in any person who is able to grieve, to move with power and authority, and to find joy and agency, even in their grief and their anger. And understand that when you move in that nuance, which Black women so often have to, that is God's work. So in that moment, with that, I invite Pastor Amy to join me.
Oh, wow. So many things. I actually don't usually take notes, so it's actually, may you know that the numbers of things I've written down is just a reflection of the amens and the, just it brought so much of what you were saying, brought up things for me as well. I'm particularly struck in what you were just saying, what you were ending with. I'm going to say this, I'm going to add this context because you don't necessarily know this just from looking at me. I'm a transracial adoptee. So my parents were white, and it makes a complex way of going through, especially like your early 20s and having these, you're going to have these power struggle conversations with your parents anyway. But then you're also having this also power struggle in your own Black womanist identity. For me, if I was a man, it'd be different, but and that the person, that layer of pushing back against institutional racism is really playing out in the very close-knit spectacle of your own family. And I remember having this huge argument with my mom. It was at a point where like our relationship just couldn't keep going forward in the way it was. There was pain and there was hurt. There were things that I was like, we can't just not acknowledge this anymore. And I remember my mom thinking and saying something like, well, it's like you say, you're just so broken, and like, I don't know what to do about that. And I realized I had this gut reaction saying, no, stop. I am hurting. And I want you to acknowledge that I've been hurt and I am hurting, but I'm not broken. Because the way she was describing broken felt like, does this mean that I'm like, I can't, like, I'm not functioning anymore? I'm like, no. I can function through all of this. If we want to have a right relationship, I can't just keep pretending that this isn't going on. And, you know, that I think that in so many ways, not only for that time in my life, but was, you know, me coming into my own womanist self in my early 20s and being grounded in that. But I also, you know, and I think you were just kind of saying that, it's just, I cannot, the liberation of speaking those things and just sort of going, I'm not gonna live with this. I don't have to just play along. I may not be able to change it all. I probably can't change it all. I'm not going to be able to change you. I don't know what's going to be different. And to me, it was also, it was one of the first steps out for me of seeing a relationship with the Trinity, not with the Trinity, but within the crucifixion, death, and resurrection, of the power of allowing and just knowing something has to die. I don't know what's going to be born next, but I'm not doing this anymore. So it just, I'm naming those things in particular because, you know, I think that my experience has been, and I'd be surprised if you don't encounter this but you can contradict me, is that oftentimes when we speak as Black women around the grief, around how much we're carrying, I often also encounter, and let's be honest, more often in white circles than I do in more multicultural circles, or particularly Black circles, a sense of greeting that all the things you have to carry as a response of it being overwhelming. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not. But I also know that that's not the only part of that story. There's also times that I've also found deep joy in the amount of power when I recognize, you know what, I'm not broken. I've had to learn these things, and it's given me a strength.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think part of I want to name it as a problem. Part of the problem for Black women is that when we name our emotions, they're picked up in spaces as weaknesses. And so that helps reinforce white supremacy and patriarchy. Oh, you're emotional, you're angry, you're crying. Oh, let me fix it. Let me help you because I'm the man or I'm the white person who can make this moment better for you. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about Black women who are able to say, yes, I am mad. My anger is justified. It's right and it's good. And it's, in this moment, it may be your fault. Right? And you don't get to shame me. And I don't need you to rescue me. I am naming a boundary. I'm naming my emotions, and I'm naming a boundary. And that should change your behavior. You don't need to change me. You need to change you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's also, it started oftentimes in sort of white supremacy culture, there's this sense of everything is about that binary. It's a problem, it's a solution, you're feeling bad. Okay, as soon as you've said, the whole point in saying that you're having a big strong emotion or naming that something is wrong is so that we can reach this place where there's no problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the older I get, the more I'm just like baffled by it. Like I literally just I don't know this land that
Mm-hmm.
you speak of where you can have a problem and then you can just work it out and then not have any problem. Or is that I mean, I
Right.
just, and I know many folks, when once I point that out, are like, oh yeah, it's not, I mean, none of us are living in a place where like, oh, we fixed it and now every 100% of my life is just all fine. But it's to me, it's also really getting back to what I long for is in my faith and for myself is in that right relationship. Because a relationship, it's not a matter of it's all going well or if it's all it's not that binary either. It's how do we live with one another in our authentic selves,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
allow us to do that.
Right. I think that's maybe what I love so much about this character, Rispa,
Mhm.
because she has been forced out of the social conventions of the world. It gives her the freedom to feel all the things that she wants to feel or needs to feel at any given moment, and to speak her truth into a situation and not be concerned, right? She doesn't have to be concerned about what David says. She doesn't need to be concerned what the soldiers say, because you've already taken everything from her. You've left her in a vulnerable state. And so I think a part of what people maybe need to recognize about Black women is like we can live, we say what we want to say or need to say, and we can live in multiple spaces at the same time, because you've already pushed us outside of the norm. So if my womanhood and my blackness means that I can't fully live in this particular space that you have constructed, which I kind of don't want to live in anyway, but it means that you don't get to dictate my behavior as I move around that space.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I find that the more you realize that, and to which in doing anti-racism and racial justice work across culture, I'm always encouraging folks. It's like there seems to be this space where, especially for those who have largely in their lives experienced white supremacy culture as a positive, I mean, unchecked or just not really noticed. It's fine. It's working for you. That there's this period of tension and much more an anxiety about feeling like things are wrong, or feeling, and I think that, and worrying about, is it messed up or is it, and I just more and more realize that I'm like, yeah, I'm just not concerned with this. Like I don't, and that to me is like, you can feel on the outside longing to be in, or wanting that sense of consonance or harmony um, that you may have if you're in the dominant hegemonic structure and your identity is in there. But if it isn't, there's this liberation and just like, oh, no one's gonna ask me my opinion anyway. And if no one's really listening when I talk, this was literally my realization when I was like 11. I was a third kid watching. It's like, maybe I'll just start talking. Like, don't just, like, maybe I'm the only one. It's like, I will sit here and amuse myself. And if, and I think there can be a freedom in that self-liberation. Here's like, oh, well,
Right. I mean,
exist in the world.
this is actually part of the kind of ethos of the Beyoncé Mass,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, oh, you have a hard time making sense of Black women as clergy anyway. You don't understand my religiosity anyway. So we're going to create a space,
Yeah.
right? Where we feel God's presence, where we talk about God, where we talk about the salvific work of Jesus in the world. I don't really care what you say. I don't, like, you don't like it? I don't
Right.
care. Like, this doesn't work for you? I can't care. Right? Like,
Right. I mean, you weren't looking before, so just, it's fine. Look away some more,
Right.
I guess.
Right.
Like,
Turn
don't,
the channel, go to a different church.
right,
Don't worry about it.
right.
Yeah.
But, and like, you know, in terms of full circle, there's with, I thank you for introducing this character of Rispa to me, because I had not, I preach, but I'm not a biblical scholar person. So these folks who are in between in these texts are really easy to not hear
Okay.
unless
Mm-hmm.
someone deconstructs that and really names it. But there's this balance between usually what we're getting called out on is something that makes someone uncomfortable for whatever that reason is. And then all of a sudden it's, so in some ways it's like whatever Rispa was saying before, was anybody listening? But when she's pointing to an ugliness, an ugly wrong done in God's name, and continues to stand there and continues to point and continues to say this, all of a sudden we're way more concerned
Mm-hmm.
with what she has to say.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we do about it? Right. And which I really also took to be, one of my notes down here is too, isn't that, you know, a natural fit how the Black Lives Matter movement is so, many people, it's now so broadly spoken to, but the fact that it's very womanist
Mm-hmm.
at its core. And to continue to say the names and show the faces of those who were killed for the safety and security and comfort of white bodies and of our culture. I mean, what we're trying to call safety, or that we have when in fact the threat is not real.
Right.
And to continue that, I just feel like that's one of the parallels I was seeing.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, because what I do is deconstruct text for a living, right? Like, I could talk about RISPA for hours, but so one of the things that I didn't talk about in the main part of this is RISPA literally means it's a translation from the Hebrew. It means like hot burning coal. And so one of the ways that the rabbis and midrash talk about her is as like her body changes the temperature, right? Changes the temperature of the environment. And I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Black Lives Matter as a womanist movement, right? Like that was a movement born out of Black women's tears. Black mothers, Black sisters, Black daughters, who are saying we're seeing too much anguish in our community, and our counterbalance is to keep crying, to keep resisting, and we are going to change the temperature.
Yeah.
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 And for which we're also going to get a lot of flack, because
Yep.
those who are comfortable with the old temperature are like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm refusing to leave.
Right.
That's going to make this whole room a lot hotter and uncomfortable, but oh well.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My new favorite character. So.
Little character, a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'm also kind of noticing that I mean, obviously, I would happily go on forever. Is there any other particular, but it's like literally down in my notes to check in on the places you found joy or hope within
So
this.
I find joy and hope in Black women's resistance. Like an angry Black woman a little bit gives me joy, right? Because again, it's like you speaking your truth, even if the world doesn't know what to do with it. And so, because the work that we do in the Beyoncé Mass, it's really we have a slightly larger team, but at the core, it's 8 Black women, right, coming together and figuring out how to subvert expectations of what Christian worship is. That's my joy. It means that on on a almost daily basis. I teach, I advise students, I write book chapters and articles and all the things that I'm supposed to do as a scholar, but a little bit of every day. Uh, I steal away with some Black women on Zoom or WhatsApp because we're, it's a global team, and we think, how do we really push the envelope and create healing space for people who have been isolated by the church? That's my hope and my joy. If everybody could do a little bit of that every day, gosh, what a world.
Yeah. And 2020 has given us many days and many ways and many reasons to do just that.
Yeah.
You are reminding me too that one of the things on my notes, one of my many things on my little paper here that I missed was in introducing you, I meant to say a little bit, name to what you were saying, that the Beyoncé Mass is not a performance. It's a worship service. And then that was going to be my segue to make sure we pray us in. So before we go to this interlude into the Q&A, I would like to just give some space to say thank you for this particular time and for your voice and a blessing on these questions and the further dialogue, if you're willing to do that with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Holy One, thank you. Thank you for the insistent, passionate, clear voice and spirit of Yolanda Norton, for the ways that she changes the temperature in the room we are in right now, even without her being in the physical room we're in, for the ways that she is moving about changing that temperature of our whole culture and shift in ways that we can hear each authentic voice. God, we ask your blessing to be upon her and to be upon all those who are attending and listening, and who in their questions and their seeking for dialogue, and that they too may step into the place of resistance and stress with joy and resilience, and to be celebrated for their strength. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to have a little interlude, which I understand, Yolanda, you're going to put on there. It's going to be some stuff from Beyoncé Mass, I believe. You can say a word about it, actually, so I'm not just getting it wrong. And then while you're doing that, while you're listening and experiencing that, you can also go to the Q&A section and post any questions you might have, and the moderators, the other background moderators and myself will take a look at those and find ways to bring that into the conversation following the interlude. I don't think we'll get to them all, but we will do our best. So thank you.
Yeah, so what we have is a 6-minute interlude. It's a little bit longer than I think you're normally used to, but it is one of the songs that we did at the last Mass that we did for Merrimack College. And I think it fits lovely with the conversation that Pastor Amy and I just had. Just a nod towards the fact that there's so much beauty and wonder in Black women's ability to own their identity and own how they live in the world. So we offer this as a kind of moment of interlude, and look forward to answering whatever questions we may.
Whew, that was powerful. And actually we got some questions here that actually are relatively easy, I think. but you get to answer them, so maybe they're not. The first one that's directly related to what we just saw is, what do their t-shirts say and what is its significance?
Yeah, so there's a young Black woman who pastors a church in Hawaii, and her and a friend of hers have created this business. And in the Black church tradition, in the call and response flow, the preachers would say, "Won't God do it? Won't He do it?" And the congregation would say back, "Won't He will?" And so that we can understand the feminine energy of the divine, this young woman created these shirts. This, "Won't she do it?" Understanding God as female, and so I saw those. I said, "Can you put that in womanist purple?" And so she has created for the Beyoncé Mass team these purple "Won't she do it" shirts. So that's the meaning.
Love it. Love it. Another one that I think, again, is relatively straightforward, so let's go for it, is, where is Rispa in the Hebrew scriptures? And you said first and second Samuel, but if you want to get a little more specific than that. And then, am I spelling her name correctly? And they'd spelled it Risbah.
Yeah, so she shows up in 1 Samuel 3, but more prominently in 2 Samuel 21, and that is Rizpah. Rizpah. Rizpah.
Got it. Thank you. And also this one looks simple, but it might probably be a little longer. Is, what is meant by sitting with someone's pain?
I think sitting with someone's pain is I think we live in a world where people too often try to fix or insert themselves in other people's pain or try to erase it. And so when I think about sitting with someone else's pain, I actually think about what happens in Job. When Job's friends come and sit with Job in his misery. And so that's, the biblical precursor for sitting Shiva in the Jewish tradition, to sit with people in their grief. And when I've preached that Job text, one of the things that I've said is when Job's friends went to extraordinary lengths to get to him in his grief, they did the thing that God had called them to do. The place where they mess up is when they start talking. And so that we have to understand the divine imperative to shut up. And so sitting with someone in their grief means being present for them in the ways that they need you to be present, rather than the ways that you want to be present for them. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what I hear also in there that is to recognize that sitting with someone's pain, because of a natural part of empathy and mirror neurons, is you will feel the pain.
Mm-hmm.
You will feel some of that. You're not going to feel it to necessarily the same degree or whatever. And that's sometimes where part of our fix-it energy can come from.
Mm-hmm.
Is we feel this pain, we're like, well, I don't want to feel that.
Mm-hmm.
So start trying to do a thing instead of actually just being present with them.
Mm-hmm.
And acknowledging that, yeah, it just hurts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So then we have let's see, we have two. One is more of sort of a statement, although she's just also kind of looking at how to amplify voices, and then I want to follow it with the specific question that's in there. So it says, it occurs to me that it's a rich opportunity for me, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to name exactly who's asking which question, but I happen to know her. She's a white woman, member of our congregation. So, for that context, and people who, like me, benefit from the system of white supremacy, to deeply feel the grief of our system being so immoral, to become more receptive to the grief and prophetic voice of Black women. Somewhere to me, this feels related to a request to talk about, this is from a Black woman within our congregation who does ministry with her home village in Kenya. She says, thank you for your ministry. Reverend Norton, could you please talk about resources, sharing, and how we bridge that gap, especially for the Black women who have mostly donated their services or have been denied equal opportunity. And I think she's naming that, the unpaid Black labor that happens, or that, the work, and so both emotional labor and actual labor of, this is important work to do, but because our culture and our society may not value it as much, and it's not, it's how do we have resources, or to not constantly just be sitting on the other side and sort of be used by it.
So for me, the very simple answer is stop doing it. I am very clear, and don't say it with I say it with as little hubris as possible for any human being. But when I enter into a space and I say to them, I have 4 degrees and I'm about to get my 5th degree. I'm highly educated. I have had careers in public policy, human resources, parish ministry, and the academy. When I enter a space, I bring a skill set that people need. And so you have to pay me for that. Yes, I believe in the work that I do. I believe that spaces need to hear my voice in the way that I think that they need to hear Black women's voices. I don't think that makes me unique. But we are talking about a world filled with highly qualified, highly skilled Black women who enter into spaces and change the game. And so we as Black women have to start saying, you don't get it. You do not get my services if you do not want to value my services, because people find resources for what they want, right? And this language of volunteering these things as holy work, as divine, is really convenient for people who are already in power and already have resources. So when we as Black women fail to say, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm not participating in this, and I'm not doing it because I feel like, because I'm trying to get rich, I'm doing it because I need you to understand, right, the value of what I bring into this space. I don't think that people who are in power, that white people, that men, are going to say, well, fine, you're just not going to do it. Because I don't think that their institutions will survive it. Right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
In this case, I hear what you're saying, and I think particularly that's true in terms of the donated emotional labor, and the unpaid pieces of, like, well, one of my phrases that often looks like, I had no intention of, like, centering conversations about race to be like what I feel called to do. I feel called to be a pastor. There's an awful lot that's other subjects. I mean, I'm trained as a musician. It'd be lovely to just be a musician, but I have to learn. I mean, so somehow doing that work, and leading with it is then, when there are experts on this, very quite specifically, who do feel called to write it and say that. I think there's also, so that to me makes sense of, like, don't do that for free. Be like, just either they have to bring in that expert, or they, just don't take that. But in this case, the person asking the question is also doing work for for her African community, her Kenyan community back home, and in terms of how, and that some of, how you do that work and find resource for renewal, find resource to do that when, and I think this is also just true of a lot of nonprofit structure, of trying to get opportunity and value around what that really takes.
So I hear that, and I hear that nuance, but I think in some ways the answer is still the same. If you're forcing people to understand, right? Like for congregations, for organizations who are now putting up posters and banners that say Black Lives Matters, now is the moment to ask the question, how are you embodying that? What are you doing to invest in those words that you hang from your church? And if
Yes.
it's just the banner, rip it down. You don't deserve it, right? And so, because I think now is the moment where we ask that question,
Mhm.
now is the moment that we hold people accountable for saying, like, again, this doesn't have to be money in my
Right.
pocket. I don't, right? Like, but you need to show me how you are investing in the communities that are important to me and that you say matter,
Yeah.
right? And so I think, again, it's a slight nuance, but it's the same principle,
Mhm.
right? Like, because I think we live in a moment where people have lots of pretty rhetoric about justice and liberation and no action. And I personally am no longer moved by people's words. And so I would just say, look for the spaces where people are naming their commitments to this and ask the question, how are you living into it? And when they are not, give them the thing that they can do that lets them live into this, that which they are saying.
Yeah. Thank you. And I know Betty even knows it, of course, before I even noticed the time and go, oh yeah, I said I'd give you that cue and close things off for you. So I'm going to hand this back to Betty and Yolanda. Just also my personal thanks, and the thanks certainly on behalf of University Congregational for all that you shared this evening and for
Thank you.
the shared space, the
Thank you.
shared ether space, whatever we're
Thank
wonderful to have that. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
have to say, I did not realize the time either. So I looked down and I thought, oh my gosh. But let me thank you as well for sharing your pain, your tears, your anguish, your anger. You are a prophet on behalf of a lot of people, but mostly on behalf of yourself. I want to just name that in your sharing tonight, you have been a prophet to us. The other note that I wrote down was, there is no woke without work. I'm saying that from my privileged position, right? I am not you two women here who have this experience. And so as we consider hosting this very creative worship service, we know that requires work. And so we're committed to that work. We don't know what that means now, but I think it provides a framework for a learning opportunity that this church is committed to. And we have a banner hanging on our building, and we have to earn that banner, I think, in a lot of ways. And I know there are people in the audience tonight that are working hard on that and what it means. But I think you give us a charge to do more, as we should. So I want to thank you for being with us tonight. Pastor Amy, thank you for the engaging conversation. Um, this has really been tremendous. So thank you, both of you, both of you. And I have to also now really in some ways conclude our 3-night series of 3 very different conversations around immigration, really around deep grief, and it was going to be around religious diversity, but we kind of strayed from that subject. That's why I'm hesitating there. And now this. And it's really great to be back as the lecture series. We want to hear back from folks in the audience what you thought of this series. The series is not over because next week you all are the speakers, but you won't be seeing me, and you won't be seeing, you won't be seeing us as the lecture series. So I want to close us out on that behalf tonight. We may send out a survey or something to kind of see what people thought of this series together. We are walking into a tremendously anxious time. I think our country has never been in this place before. And frankly, it's that, I said this earlier in the series, but the John Denver's Joy and Sorrow song, I heard way back in our own, I think it was Palm Sunday service, our very new virtual choir sang that, and it just grew, and that little song just stayed in my head, because this year is all about deep grief, but it is only through that grief, I believe, that some of us can shift enough to be open, which is the joy, right? The transformative joy of changing our preconceived notions of what this world is, to be able to listen to stories of immigration, to be able to listen to stories of grief, to be able to listen to stories of Black women. So thank you all very much for all that. Have a blessed week. I don't have to say to vote to this group, because I'll bet there's nobody in this audience tonight that hasn't voted yet. But I will say, remind your friends and neighbors to vote, because that's important too. And come back next week, and blessings to all of you. Thank you.